The psychiatrists listen to the stories of the men who tell them as best they can. The names and places are different. The circumstances are different. But through all the stories runs one thread: death and the fear of death.
From the earliest days of human conflicts, the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder have plagued humanity. While certainly not the first instance of bias against soldiers displaying signs of PTSD, the Civil War was one of the first major conflicts involving modern warfare. This new type of warfare saw a sharp increase in soldiers displaying signs of PTSD, and unfortunately, a sharp increase in stigma and bias against those soldiers. Anyone displaying signs of PTSD were often regarded as weak and homesick. The Assistant Surgeon General in 1864 was once quoted saying, "It is by lack of discipline, confidence, and respect that many a young soldier has become discouraged and made to feel the bitter pangs of homesickness, which is usually the precursor of more serious ailments." World War I introduced a new term, coined shell shock, that was attributed to the horrors of the war. Again, those that displayed such symptoms were regarded as weak and unfit, leaving little to no treatment for such individuals. As time progressed and another world war began, another term was created to explain the symptoms that battle-weary soldiers displayed: combat fatigue. The general consensus was that every man and woman had the potential for such fatigue if exposed to combat for long enough. This was the first major turning point for the recognition and treatment of those afflicted with PTSD, opening up the possibilities for treatment for the disorder. Unfortunately, though, bias was still prevalent, as the commander of the 7th Army, General George Patton, was said to have slapped 2 soldiers undergoing treatment for combat fatigue, stating,
"Don't admit this yellow bastard. Nothing wrong with him. We won't have sons of bitches who are afraid to fight stinking up this place of honor."
General Patton would later be relieved of command following the incident. In 1952, the DSM-1 coined the term gross stress reaction to explain the symptoms soldiers displayed during war, marking another major step in providing treatment to soldiers afflicted with the disorder. Later, the term gross stress reaction would be updated in the DSM-2 for unspecified reasons. Finally, in 1980, the DSM-3 coined the term post-traumatic stress disorder, offering more realistic and long-term treatment options.
According to the DSM-5, individuals with PTSD exhibit 3 characteristic groups of symptoms. The first involves re-experiencing the traumatic event or events in flashbacks or nightmares. The second group is characterized by hyperarousal, including difficulties modulating startle responses. The last group, deactivation, may constitute feelings of isolation and depression. Within the context of learning, PTSD is characterized by the impaired extinction of a hyperreactive response to now harmless stimuli. The neuroscience of PTSD involves a number of neural structures. Perhaps the most commonly mentioned is the amygdala, which has been heavily implicated in emotional fear learning. These nuclei are responsible for activating downstream structures, all of which contribute to mediate behavioral responses to fearful situations. During fear conditioning trials, veterans with PTSD, compared to controls, exhibited enhanced amygdala activity and increased communication between the amygdala and thalamus. This direct pathway between the amygdala and thalamus bypasses sensory cortices, allowing for more immediate responses to what the brain deems potential threats. Therefore, in patients with PTSD, these fearful responses are more readily activated. Additionally, when veterans are shown pictures of faces with different emotional expressions, faces with fearful expressions induced elevated levels of epinephrine to the amygdala. Combined with excess levels of corticotropin-releasing hormone commonly associated with PTSD, the interactions between these neurochemicals contribute to a hypervigilant state in afflicted individuals. Finally, studies have shown that stressful situations can trigger serotonin release from Raphi nuclei to GABAergic inhibitory neurons, not just to the amygdala, but also to the hippocampus and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which plays a role in consciously mediating fear responses. Experimental administration of serotonin agonist in veterans with PTSD has been shown to induce acute anxiety attacks, showing another way in which abnormalities in the amygdala may contribute to maladaptive behavior. Next, the hippocampus is critical for processing the spatial details and relevance of stimuli that may indicate a threatening situation in one context and a latent situation in another. Individuals with PTSD have shown reduced overall hippocampal volumes, as well as decreased dendritic branching and spines and impaired neurogenesis. This indicates there may be diminished function of the hippocampus in terms of correctly interpreting spatial cues during startling situations. In addition, there is a subsequent dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, as the structure plays a critical role in providing negative feedback to regulate glucocorticoid release. This results in elevated blood cortisol levels, exacerbating stress responses in individuals with PTSD. A recent study has shown, however, that the smaller hippocampus phenotype implicated in PTSD may be a pre-existing genetic vulnerability, which increases the likelihood of individuals developing the disorder, as opposed to a result of neurotoxicity due to trauma. The study examines monozygotic twins, of which one was exposed to combat and the other was not. Twins of veterans that exhibited high-severity PTSD had significantly smaller hippocampi than those of veterans without PTSD and their twins, suggesting the phenotype was present independent of combat exposure. However, on the whole, the findings of the study found a clear correlation between hippocampal volume and PTSD severity in veterans, lending support to the structure's important role in the disorder. Finally, the prefrontal cortex plays a vital role in consciously regulating visceral fear responses and mediating extinction of stimuli that previously predicted but no longer indicate an unsafe environment. fMRI activity in veterans with PTSD during fear conditioning training shows diminished activity from the ventromedial prefrontal cortex to the amygdala, suggesting a decrease in top-down inhibition of fear responses. Individuals with PTSD also exhibit a downregulation of alpha-2 adrenergic receptors. In veterans, experimental administration of yohimbine, an antagonist of this receptor, decreased prefrontal cortex metabolic activity and induced panic attacks, flashbacks, and other core symptoms of PTSD. This result, interestingly, was not replicated in patients with generalized anxiety disorder, perhaps suggesting a disproportionately severe dysregulation of adrenergic signaling in patients diagnosed with PTSD compared to other anxiety disorders.
First example used to illustrate the bias against veterans in society is the court case of Manker versus Spencer. Tyson Manker filed a case March 2, 2018 against the United States Navy due to their bias towards veterans suffering from PTSD acquired while serving in the Navy or Marine Corps. Manker enlisted in the Marine Corps in December of 1999, and his unit was then deployed to Kuwait, and they led their Iraq invasion. On the way to secure a base in Baghdad, the vehicle behind his hit a landmine and was blown up. Manker's unit was ambushed upon reaching Baghdad, and he witnessed many deaths, both civilian and enemy. Manker was then chosen to lead a Quick Reaction Force, QRF, which provided immediate reinforcements to units that unexpectedly came in contact with enemy forces. During his time as a QRF leader, Manker responded to a report of 2 enemy trucks filled with weapons. His unit apprehended them, and at the end of the mission, he shot at what he thought was a fleeing enemy soldier. However, it turned out to be a civilian teenage girl. Toward the end of his deployment, Manker witnessed the death of his close friend, and he was given the task of cleaning up his remains. Nearing the end of his deployment, Manker realized he was suffering from risk factors and symptoms of PTSD. Manker reported his symptoms to his superior officers. However, they did not refer him for further treatments or evaluations by doctors. Once Manker returned home, his PTSD symptoms worsened, and he, along with 2 other Marines, decided to self-medicate with marijuana. When Manker returned to base, he was charged with the use of a controlled substance and met again with his superior officers. When he explained that he used marijuana to help alleviate his PTSD, his superiors referred him to substance abuse counseling. At the conclusion of the counseling, Manker was found not to be dependent on controlled substances. However, he was recommended for treatment for PTSD, which was again ignored. Manker was then discharged from the Marine Corps with an other than honorable discharge, OTH status. After being discharged, Manker sought medical treatment and was formally diagnosed with PTSD. His doctor referred him to the VA for treatment, but he was turned away due to his OTH discharge status. The VA failed to educate Manker about applying for a Character of Service Determination, CSD, which would afford him some benefits from the VA. Although Manker was finally able to access some VA benefits, he lost 7 years of treatment time as well as benefits from the GI Education Bill. Manker finally decided to apply for a records review through the Naval Discharge Review Board, NDRB, to change his discharge status to honorable. Unfortunately, the NDRB dismisses 85% of PTSD-related OTH discharge upgrade requests. Manker's request was denied on the grounds that he willfully chose to violate the terms of honorable service by smoking marijuana. Manker is currently fighting for the rights of veterans in similar positions who received OTH discharge status as a result of PTSD that they acquired during their service. If Manker wins his case, the Navy will be forced to change his status to an honorable discharge. Manker argued that the Navy has an institutional bias against their servicemen and women who have suffered from PTSD as a result of their time in the Navy or Marine Corps. The second societal example of bias against veterans with PTSD occurred in the manner of a research study conducted by Margaret Harrell and Nancy Berglass. Unemployment among veterans who served in the military after September 11, 2001 is higher than any other previous war. They researched why companies were not hiring veterans and interviewed 69 companies in order to obtain their results. Of the companies interviewed, a few reasons recurred while asking why they were not hiring veterans. First, the companies argued that civilians do not understand military work and are unsure as to how veteran skills could be translated to their company. Second, there are negative stereotypes that veterans with PTSD can be violent and have anger management issues. Employers are also worried that veterans in the reserves will leave for further deployments. Employers worry that veterans need time to acclimate back into civilian life and that they will need company resources to help integrate back into society. Finally, the resources for matching veterans with companies are very confusing to navigate, making veterans difficult for employers to find. These reasons apply to veterans both with and without PTSD. Unfortunately, veterans with PTSD face even more bias than other former soldiers. The following statements came directly from interviews in regards to veterans with PTSD. I think the only reason that companies might be hesitant to hire veterans is because of PTSD. They don't want to hire someone that is not only unknown, but may be damaged too. Another company said, I have heard about some veterans coming back and going on rampages. Furthermore, 19 companies said PTSD played a role in their hiring decisions of veterans. One area of change that is needed to support veterans with PTSD is ending the stigma, especially reinforced in the military, that it is weak to seek help for mental health. Sadie Dingfelder, a writer for the American Psychological Association, interviewed Lieutenant Justin Diorenzio, a doctor in psychology. He recounted that they were afraid to be seen going into my office, so they'd scoot next to me and say, off the record, can I get your ear for a second? Soldiers are afraid to seek mental health help because they are under the assumption that it could negatively affect their military careers or even lead them to being discharged. Currently, there is a stigma that seeking help for mental health makes a person weak, an image that is very different from what a soldier should be. One possible solution to this problem is to train superior officers to better recognize signs of PTSD and to offer confidential support to their unit. Furthermore, it should be drilled into the soldiers' heads that seeking help for mental health does not make a person weak, but instead it strengthens their minds and prepares them for a longer and more successful career. Finally, the media has played a huge role in propagating negative stereotypes about veterans with PTSD. For example, in Fort Hill shooting in 2009, U.S. Army Major Nadal Malik Hassan killed 13 people and wounded 30 others. The media falsely reported that Hassan suffered from PTSD acquired during his time in the military. Upon further evaluation, doctors revealed that Hassan did not display any of the symptoms of PTSD and that it did not play a factor in the shooting. The media needs to gain a better understanding of how their negative coverage of PTSD affects the public's perception of veterans. The media can play a huge role in reversing some of the bias that society has towards veterans with PTSD, and efforts need to be made in portraying these people in a more positive light.